And now we come to the meat and potatoes of my paper, which is my analysis of the steps through the lens of the four cardinal virtues. So we have determined that what is called the problem or the spiritual malady is lack of internal order, and that alcoholism is a vicious pursuit of internal order. In order to solve this problem, the spiritual solution must restore internal order. It is through virtue that we order the faculties of the soul. Therefore, the steps must have some relationship to the four cardinal virtues. The virtues of temperance and fortitude order one's emotional life. The virtue of justice orders our relationship with others, and prudence is the mother of all virtues. Prudence informs the other virtues, and other virtues are virtues only inasmuch as they participate in prudence. And outside of prudence, there is no virtue at all. We will start with investigating prudence. Prudence is defined as the application of right reason to action. So it has two components: the use of reason and action based on that reason. The measure that someone is in touch with reality is the measure that they are prudent. So prudence is an intellectual virtue because it orders the intellect to the truth. It is also a moral virtue because it perfects the will through reasonable action. This is important because the alcoholic's main problem is he is separated from reality. Dr. Silkworth said in The Doctor's Opinion of the Alcoholic that from pursuing the effect of inebriation, after a while the alcoholic cannot differentiate the true from the false. So the main problem with alcoholism comes from a separation from reality. Recovery must necessarily address this. The separation from reality comes in two forms. First, the explicit separation of reality that comes from obsession, the specific thought pattern that leads the alcoholic to drink despite knowing better. And second, the pervasive separation from reality that encompasses his model of the world, his understanding of himself and others, and makes his alcoholism possible. It is this second distortion of recovery that recovery works on, with the consequence of rectifying the first. This is why prudence is necessary. It is prudence that rectifies the mind of the alcoholic to the truth about himself and others and empowers him to make sane decisions about his recovering life. Prudence rectifies the decision-making process. All decision starts with an is and ends with an ought. Basically, it starts with a truth and ends with an obligation for action based on that truth. If the is that a decision is based on is not found in reality, making a right decision is impossible. Decisions also have to do with means and ends. Errors in decision come in two forms: choosing the wrong means to an end, or a misunderstanding of the end. I say misunderstanding because we don't choose our ends properly. Our ends are hardwired by the natural law. But we can have a false understanding of our ends. We can work towards ends that are contrary to the natural law. If the end of one life is false, the entire life will be disordered. So prudence starts with acknowledgement of an end that conforms with the natural law, deciding on the correct means to that end, and acting on that decision. Prudence is also the application of universal principles to particular decisions in the here and now. It's prudence that leads one from knowledge of it is prudence that leads one from the knowledge that eating too much is bad to I should only eat one hamburger because that is not too much. All the roles of prudence are clarified by an investigation of the practical syllogism. Syllogism is a natural form of reasoning that we use to make decisions. They come in the form of two prepositions and a conclusion based on the relationship between those two prepositions. For example, all A's are B's, all B's are C's, and therefore all A's are C's. Now we know in the steps a pivotal decision is made that rectifies the life of the alcoholic. So if we analyze the decision-making process in the steps, it should be congruent with our understanding of prudence. So, for example, alcoholics experience the phenomenon of craving and obsession. I experience the phenomenon of craving and obsession. Therefore, I'm an alcoholic. Alcoholism is a hopeless state of body and mind. I'm an alcoholic. Therefore, I suffer from a hopeless state of body and mind. There is hope for the alcoholic in God. I am an alcoholic. Therefore, there is hope for me in God. The alcohol finds God by turning his will and his life over to him. I need to find God. Therefore, I must turn my will and my life over to God. First of all, this is so obvious I'm embarrassed to write it down and present it as significance, but it is a useful form and clarifies certain things about the steps. Presupposed in the syllogism chain is the search for happiness. Happiness is the ultimate goal of every man, and everything we do for the sake of happiness, yet we do not pursue happiness for any further goal. Happiness is sufficient. We pursue drugs and alcohol for the sake of happiness, and we recover for the sake of happiness. The question arises, what is happiness? If our ultimate goal is happiness, then our understanding of happiness will determine our entire life. The alcohol needs to make a profound change to recover, and there is no profound change than to change the purpose of one's life. For once the end is clarified, then we can determine the proper means to the end. If I erroneously believe that happiness is found in myself, all the means I employ to reach that end will prove futile. In acknowledging that one is hopeless, the alcoholic acknowledges that the purpose of his life is false. Therefore, the alcohol must change the end that orders his life. That which we give our wills and our lives over to is the end of our life. The happiness we seek can only be found in God. Once the end is clarified, the means fall into place. Steps 4 through 12, and indeed our entire life, are means to the end. You cannot reach an end through the mean. You cannot reach an end but through the means. Steps 1 through 3 are insufficient to reach our end because they do not deal with means. Steps 1 through 3 only establish a rational decision. A decision necessarily leads to action. Establishing of ends in our life is powerful, but it is not enough. We must use the necessary means. We must use the correct means to that end, or we will not reach it. Steps 4 through 12 are the correct means and absolutely necessary. No other means will suffice. Not necessarily to reach God in general, but for the alcoholic to reach God. Many have tried. Going to church and volunteering will be insufficient. Reading self-help books and introspection with a therapist will be insufficient. This may sound closed-minded, but in my personal experience and my investigation of the steps, I have come to understand that given the problem the alcoholic suffers from, that each step is necessary for the alcoholic and nothing else will suffice. The necessity of each of the steps I am able to hope to communicate. A prudent decision begins with an is and ends with an ought, a moral obligation. A moral obligation is being bound to certain actions. The practical syllogism always leads to actions. It is common knowledge that taking action is necessary for recovery. Why is this? Because the alcoholic needs to make a profound internal change to recover. Other means are insufficient. Changing your girlfriend, changing your city won't cut it. Changing your job won't cut it. Our moral life is the deepest part of ourselves. It is our heart. There is no attribute of ourselves that is more significant. I am tall, or I am intelligent. I am a good man, or I am a bad man. Our life and our view of ourselves and others is founded on our moral life. So in order to effect a change that is significant enough to recover, the steps must cause a moral change. Aristotle said that our moral life is made up of actions. It is through our actions that we become good or bad, that we become. It is through our moral actions that we change our essence, that we enlarge our essence or diminish it. We become more human or less. We choose to participate in truth, beauty, and goodness more or less. There is no such thing as a purely intellectual morality. We become good by acts of our spiritual will, which necessarily involve action. And when I say man is moral, I am simply saying that he is free and he has free will. Although the addict is not free from obsession when obsession is manifesting, he is free in other areas, and it is by this use of his freedom in other areas that freedom from obsession is obtained. What is freedom? All moral choices can be reduced to acting according to our nature or contrary to it. This is virtue and vice. Alcoholism is so damaging because we are acting contrary to our nature. Therefore, in recovery, we must take actions congruent with our nature. I will say more about this later. A right decision must necessarily proceed by a correct understanding of reality, or the decision maker will miss their end. What is the reality of the alcoholic? Hopelessness and hope. The sponsee has such a tenuous grasp on reality surrounding their drug and alcohol use that the hopelessness of their situation must be beaten into them, or they come to it through significant suffering. This big book spends a significant amount of space on this issue. Alcoholism is a hopeless state of body and mind that leads to insanity and death. Any other thought about alcohol is a cognitive distortion and is the result of obsession. Feelings of hopelessness and of hope are the ultimate motivating factors in one's life. The addict must experience a type of despair around their drug use. But there is hope in God. This truth is so beautiful and simple, I don't know what to say about it. There is so much hopelessness and evil in the world. We could easily live in a world where alcoholism was hopeless and that was the end of the matter. There is nothing in the nature of the world that makes recovery necessary. There is nothing that we could do to deserve the intervention of God. The second step speaks to this fundamental truth of the universe, that good triumphs over evil, even though it may be hard to see. We live in a universe where God exists. He is the author of free will and will intervene to free man from slavery. It has been said that no natural desire goes unfulfilled. Ducks desire water, water exists. Man desires women, women exist. And man, in the depths of his heart, desires a supreme good which will completely fulfill him. His career as an alcoholic could be nothing other than the attempt to find this. It is God that man ultimately desires, and God exists. Our life in recovery is a testament of this. One useful consequence of presenting the first steps in a practical syllogism, because it clarifies where there is faulty thinking in the sponsees in early recovery. The syllogism is in a format of reasoning from universal truth to particular instances. So one can err in the reasoning about universals or particulars. For example, one may reject the particular proposition in the first syllogism, I experience the phenomenon of craving, because they only occasionally experience the phenomenon of craving, and conclude they're not alcoholic. Or another common one is the rejection of the universal proposition, alcoholism is hopeless. One may admit that they are an alcoholic, and for you it might be hopeless, but for themselves there is still some hope. They can squeeze some happiness out of it. This kind of this kind of thinking is the consequence of obsession, and usually there's not much reasoning that goes into it. It is because this is the common error in early recovery that the big book spends a significant amount of time driving home the fact that alcoholism is hopeless. Another common error is not taking the action required after a decision is made. This is called incontinence. We see this with most attempts at the step work. Because of the basic fact that taking action is hard. This incontinence is the result of disordered emotions that keep one from acting on what they know is right. Usually fear causes this. All these errors in thinking are solved by more suffering. It's suffering that beats the alcoholic and unreasonable, as the big book has pointed out. One day while I was in a mental hospital, I was walking with a girl who had schizophrenia. Part of her symptoms of her illness was that she would ramble on with crazy nonsense out loud. And while she was rambling, she said this: "If you haven't learned from your fear and suffering, you need more fear and suffering." I thought that was very wise. Another thing the syllogism chain shows is the necessary role of fellowship in recovery. Individualistic recovery is impossible. It is from the group of drunks that we get the universal propositions that there is hope in God, or you can find God by turning your will and life over to Him. The alcoholic is utterly unable to come to these truths by considering his case alone. It is through others that we have hope. The alcoholic must have faith in God to recover. He must be God-reliant. But this begins with faith in the group. One of the ends that man is hardwired by the natural law is fellowship. Man is a social animal, whether he likes it or not. And it is this end that is destroyed by alcoholism. Dependence on others for hope begins to heal the alcoholic and restore this end in his life. A house has integral parts without which it would not be a house, beams and roof, etc. So the virtue of prudence has integral sub-virtues out of which prudence could not exist. These are numerous, and I will elaborate only on the ones I think especially pertinent to recovery. The first of which is memory. Prudence is about acting upon reality, and this necessarily involves memory. The virtue of memory isn't about recalling facts. It's about correctly remembering the truth of experience. It is through our memory that our relationship with reality hinges, good or bad. Think of the essential role that memory has played in your addiction and recovery. It is our memory that obsession distorts, that allows us to make the same bad choices over and over. It is the failure of our memory that allows us to conveniently forget or minimize the consequences of our using when it comes to make that decision again. The failure of memory can keep one in the cycle of addiction for years. It is our memory that the first step rectifies when we admit our life of addiction is defined by obsession and the phenomenon of craving, and that looking at our addiction from any other view is a distortion. It is our memory that the fourth step rectifies by bringing us to the essential truth of ourselves. It is a correct memory that is essential for being in touch with reality, and is the memory that is the most danger of being distorted. Acceptance is the consent to reality. What this shows us is that reality is not passive, is not a passive thing that happens to us, but we play a role in shaping our reality. Note that truth is not that truth is relative, but that we choose to conform to reality or not. The untruth that the addict lives under doesn't fall out of the sky. The addict chooses his world. Dishonesty is pervasive in the life of the addict, and this dishonesty begins with a dishonest memory. The great truth that the addict learns in recovery is that self-will fails us. One symptom of self-will is an allness, thinking that one has all the answers, and with this attitude, the addict runs his life into the ground. An integral part of prudence and an attitude of recovery necessary for recovery is called docility, which is the open-mindedness of the counsel of others. If someone's life is unmanageable, they must come to the truth of the failure of self-will. If the addict's best efforts have failed, this logically leads to an openness to the advice of others. This openness is the beginning of recovery and leads to the necessary role in the fellowship has in recovery. That we must humble ourselves to seek the advice of others who have gone before us. This humility for the addict usually is beaten into him from the consequences of bad decisions. This openness ultimately manifests itself to openness to God to act in our life. But that openness begins with and is preceded by openness to a sponsor and fellowship. Docility opens the addict up to the universal propositions in the above syllogism chain, and the addict can come to understand that the life is unmanageable, through introspection, but he cannot come to the truth that there is a God willing to help him through introspection. He must come to experience, he must be open to the experience of others. A theme that runs through the addiction is closure. The addict closes himself, from his fellows, and from God. Recovery, in order to rectify this, must open the addict to himself, to his fellows, and to God. This openness begins with docility.